Okay, hello everyone, and my name is coming to you from Phoenix, Arizona. So I should say good afternoon where it is for you. It's morning for me. It's a great pleasure to be able to chair this session, and we have a wonderful panel ahead of us. So let's begin right away. My understanding is that everyone will be sharing their screen and showing their own presentation. This particular session that Ergon has organized is new finds from excavations, museums, or collections. And this is round number 4. Our first speaker is Handan Yildizen from Hacettepe University. And the paper will be a new mound site and necropolis in Izmir in the light of Aegaea and other finds of Peru. So Handan, if you would like to begin, terrific.
Firstly, I would like to thank the organizing committee for holding this great and fruitful event. This story that we have been carrying out for 2 years in nature, it is surrounding in the Cappadocia region, we discovered a large number of necropolises from the Roman period. One of the primary bases of our studies has become determining which settlements are related to these necropolises. Last year, we made a new discovery by the village of Çalış near Avanos. Will shed light on this issue. This discovery is the Balkri necropolis, located 10 kilometers north of Çalış. The necropolis contains 150 graves, some of which have been damaged as a result of illegal excavation. However, while findings concerning the graves, architecture and finds from the 10 different graves shed light on the chronology of the necropolis. This necropolis covers a large area. Its circular shape surrounds a mound called Balkri. This mound was previously visited by Palazzo and Server. However, no detailed research concerning was carried out. Findings from this necropolis and its related mound constitute the theme of my presentation. An agate gem discovered in grave 51 is one of the most significant archaeological finds for determining the chronology of the necropolis. The gem has a slightly convex surface with an integral of the head of Athena on it. In this section, I will try to evaluate the gem on stylistic grounds through analogies that I have established. But I first would like to state that I'm not a gem expert. Therefore, I will be delighted if any of my dear colleagues among us share their ideas about it. The portrayal of Athena, in particular, the goddess' hairstyle and her crested Corinthian hat, closely resembled the depiction of her on the coins of Archelaus, last king of Cappadocia. Similar representation of the gods are to be found in Roman period lamps from Tarsus and Athenian agora, and on a seal impression from Zeugma. It is known that during the second half of the 1st century, the taste in gems turned to highly classizing. However, although gems of this style are rare before Augustan age, it is unclear how long the types remained current. This framework suggests that this type appears to have been derived from Crassilas Athena, the origin of which we know from the Roman copy of Athena Veletri. Besides, shape and style are perhaps the best guide for imperial period. Gems often have convex faces until the late 1st century ED. Then they tend to become flat. Compare with the Hellenistic period, simplification in the depiction technique of the gems is generally associated with the later periods of the Roman Empire. However, while the slightly complex surface of our example and the goddess physiognomy and linear hairstyle recall the stylistic characteristic of the classical period, and her relatively less detailed stylization make the artwork seem more likely to date to 1st and 2nd century ED. Similar gems with sample depiction from the same period are to be found in Erimtan, Silifke, and the Getty Museum. On the other hand, all the other finds from necropolis, including imported Eastern Sigillata A fragments and daily used vessels, and also Aegea's Unguentarium, point to the 2nd century BC and the 1st century AD for the date of the necropolis. These are dated based on their close similar fragments from nearby sites, such as Alişer, Tabium, Ziyaret Suyu, Porsuk, and other sites such as Gözlükule, Soli, Yasos, Aşvankale, Hama, Samaria, and Tel Anafa. The finds discovered by illegal excavation on the mound also support the findings from necropolis. Fragments of either imported or locally molded and Eastern Sigillata A ceramics found on the mound can be dated to late Hellenistic and early Roman periods by comparison with examples from sites such as Alişer, Boğazköy, Tabium, Topaklı'dan, Kuludu, and Ayseria. In addition to these findings, other data pointing to the late Hellenistic period of the settlement come from the Çalış site. The slam relief on the one of the Pitoi unearthed in the neighborhood of the Çalış can be dated the late Hellenistic period due to the fact that its schematic structure is less detailed than sculpture, elliptic, and choroplastic artworks. This pitos is evidence that wine production in the region began in antiquity. And considering the concepts of the Dionysus cult and Dionysic festivals that were supported by local kings in the Hellenistic period, it also indicates the presence of the Dionysus cult in the region. On the other hand, two milestones from the settlement's Roman period are also known. One of them found in Belkrio, and the other was found in Sarılar, near Topaklı and Zantköyük, southwest of Belkrio. According to Palako, these milestones were part of a road system that evolved in the settlements north of the Avanos in the Roman period. To conclude, I think it would be useful to remind that this new necropolis and its settlement, which again, gem and other findings have led us today to the late Hellenistic Roman period, have only been evaluated based on the survey. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Handan. That was a beautiful gem. Okay, let's have our second paper. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Joanna Smith from the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. She'll be speaking on seals and seal rings from Marion and Arsinoe in Northwest Cyprus. Joanna.
Thank you very much for including this paper in this exciting conference and for attending my talk today. Today, I'll be reviewing the corpus of seals from Polis Chrysoukous, Cyprus, a town on the northwest coast of the Republic of Cyprus. It is the location of two ancient cities. Marion is the older of the two cities. Established in the early first millennium BC, Marion was destroyed at least in part by the army of King Ptolemy I Soter in 312 BC. Marion was renamed Arsinoe, probably in the mid-3rd century BC, in honor of Queen Arsinoe II, the sister and wife of King Ptolemy II, Philadelphus. The settlement, sanctuaries, and cemeteries of Marion and Arsinoe are framed by two rivers, the Chrysoukous at the west and the Myrmakov on the east. The seals, seal rings, and seal pendants with intaglio designs from these two ancient cities were made of a variety of materials, including precious stones and metals, as well as other stones, metal, composite material, and glass. Many of the seals and seal rings from the excavation of tombs at Polis by German, British, Swedish, and Cypriot archaeologists have formed parts of John Boardman's well-known publications of archaic and classical seals and seal rings. There are additional seals from those excavations that remain little known or unpublished. Furthermore, archival research has revealed that many more seals and rings were recorded in late 19th century excavations, but to date they have not been located in museum storerooms or connected with an illustration of an object. When recorded, the fine locations of these well over 60 intaglios are exclusively from cemeteries along the south side of the town, marked here in red. Excavations since 1983 by the Princeton Cyprus expedition have focused on the settlements of Marion and Arsinoe rather than the tomb fields. These areas of excavation are in the northern part of town, marked in orange near the ancient coastline. These excavations have recorded the seals illustrated here. They are a conoid, a reshaped conoid, a cylinder, two pendants, 6 seal-impressed terracotta loom weights, and 2 seal-impressed jars. They were recorded in the excavations and date from the Archaic through the Roman period. Not the focus of this paper today are, in addition, a loom weight marked with the side of a finger ring, an unpierced weight marked with the back of a scarab, and a worn lead seal ring. There are also stamped amphora handles, such as Rhodian examples, that are not the focus today. On the left are seals and impressions from the 8th through the 5th century BC. On the right are seals and impressions from the 4th century BC into the Roman period. In the following slides, I review these finds in relationship to seals, seal rings, and seal pendants found in the cemeteries of Polis to show how older gems were sometimes reused and even recut, and provide evidence for the relationships among seals deposited in funerary, votive, and residential contexts. The earliest deposits with seals and seal rings date to the 8th and 7th centuries BC of the Cypro-Archaic period. To put this period in historical context, the earliest possible mention of Marion is in an inscription of the Assyrian king Esarhaddon in 673-672 BC. Before and after the fall of Assyria in 612 BC, Phoenician culture was a common part of Cypriot life. After the fall of Assyria, connections with Egypt grew, continuing even after Persian claims to control parts of Cyprus in the later 6th century into the 5th century BC. The limestone conoid at the top left with a bull and calf or goat may date as early as the 11th century BC and was buried in a votive deposit at a sanctuary. Seals from tombs shown here are a Phoenician scarab with a sphinx set into a necklace pendant and a gold ring with a pseudo-Egyptian hieroglyphs. These early seals from the city of Marion compare with additional seals from late geometric to early Cypro-Archaic deposits. These are also conoids and scarabs, as well as one cylinder seal. What is notable about all the pieces on this slide is that they are all of late Bronze Age date, but have been passed down, rediscovered, and even reworked before their deposit in later period contexts. Most remarkable is a small ring stone from a sanctuary dedicated to a goddess here at the upper center of the slide. It was found in a late 6th century BC deposit on the porch of the main temple building. It is made of a stone called picrolite, a soft light blue or green to gray stone. This stone is found in deposits in the Troodos Mountains of Cyprus. This gem has been cut down from a late Bronze Age conoid seal like that at the left. It was cut just at the base of the piercing. There is a small trace of the old horizontal piercing remaining. Its lower surface has been reworked with a scene of a cow suckling a calf. This same stamp, now redesigned into a ringstone, bears a design that compares well with the popular theme of animals on seals of the late Cypro-Archaic period during the 6th century BC at Polis. It compares especially well with a carnelian scarab found in a tomb here at the bottom center. When the fine location of these scenes of animals and animal combat are known, they all come from the same cemetery, which is near the sanctuary where the picrolite gem was discovered. Is it possible that some others of these seals were carved at Marion? A long-lived and popular ring type is the leaf-shaped ring, so popular at Marion, more so than elsewhere on Cyprus, that it seems that these rings were likely made locally. Usually made from a single band with the bezel made thinner and flat, as you can see clearly in the side view of the ring at the bottom. These objects date from the very end of the 6th century BC and continued in popularity into the first part of the 4th century BC. These rings were found both in the cemetery where the animal-themed seals were found and in 3 other cemetery areas further to the west. These rings also bear single animals, but they also have scenes of deities such as Eros on the gold ring at the bottom left, a Greek inscription in the local Cypriot script, and plant motifs. The size of these rings show that they were made for people with narrow fingers, women and children. That at the top left is barely a centimeter in diameter. Its design of a single animal, a lion, is similar in stance to the animal engraved on a leaf-shaped finger ring used to mark a loom weight, shown here at the top near the left-hand side of the slide. This loom weight marks the beginning of a series of stamped weights found in the westernmost part of the city, excavated by the Princeton team. A similar leaf-shaped ring, shown here at the top center of the slide, was found in the sanctuary near the redesigned picrolite ringstone I just discussed. Its surface is too worn for any design to be made out. The city of Marion saw unrest around 500 BC, possibly due to the Ionian revolt and disagreements about allegiances with Persia. All across the excavation areas, the Princeton team found destruction deposits and cleanups from destruction. The eastern part of the city was abandoned, although tombs in the eastern cemeteries continued in use. The settlement now concentrated in the western part of the city. One cylinder seal comes from a cleanup around 500 BC at a sanctuary now at the eastern limits of the city. This sanctuary was dedicated to a female goddess, eventually known as Aphrodite, and possibly also a male god, Zeus. This cylinder seal with a scene of heroic combat finds parallels in the fortification archive at Persepolis. This Achaemenid Persian cylinder was carved after 522 BC and partly recut before its final deposit. 2 seals used to mark loom weights also find parallels among seals used at Persepolis, this time among sealings from the treasury, suggesting that they date in the 2nd quarter of the 5th century BC. The loom weight at the right is contemporary with the gem used to mark it. The loom weight at the left, however, is later. It seems that someone was using an earlier ring to mark a weaving tool in the 4th century BC. It is one of a series of marked weights from a later classical period weaving workshop in the westernmost part of the excavated area of the city. This remarkable number of Achaemenid Persian or Persianizing gems at Polis, indeed on Cyprus as a whole, contrasts with finds in tombs. Apart from the leaf-shaped rings discussed previously, seals and seal rings in tombs relate most strongly to Greek forms. Studies of male athletes, as seen here in 3 of the seals at the left, and the god Hermes at the upper left, emphasize the male physique. The scaraboid with Hermes is attributed to the Simon master. Uncertain evidence suggests that these come from the westernmost cemetery at Polis. Seals such as this one with a single bust at the right continued to be placed in tombs with their owners in the cemetery further east. Additional rings and ringstones come from 5th century tombs at Polis. A black stone with a charging bull compares with Greek gem carving. A green jasper Phoenician scarab, here at the top right, shows a seated god before an incense burner that is similar in form to incense burners found in tombs and sanctuaries at Polis. This East Greek gold ring showing Athena and her owl bears the name Onyxiles written in the Greek alphabet. While the leaf-shaped rings may have been made at Marion, the majority of seals from the period after 500 BC appear to be imports, with several from outside the island. It is striking when we turn to the later classical period in the 4th century BC that seals and seal rings, save for a few of the leaf-shaped rings and an animal scarab, that these were not placed in tombs. Instead, we find the most extensive use of seal rings for making impressions. In addition to the short cylindrical disc-shaped loom weight marked with a Persianizing ring that I mentioned before, there are another 3 short cylindrical loom weights from the same workshop that bear gem impressions. In addition, there are weights marked with the side of a ring and one with a finger impression. Most distinctive is a late 4th century stamp, likely a metal ring, that depicts Aphrodite and Eros here at the center left. I've published these objects, but new to the corpus is a mark left on the handle of a jug here at the lower right. It comes from the same workshop area. This 3/4 view of a woman's face and crown compares with late 4th century metal rings and very late 4th century sculpted representations of Aphrodite wearing a turreted crown, as shown here at the upper right. In 312 BC, the city of Marion was at least partly razed by the army of the king of Egypt, Ptolemy I Soter. Evidence from the excavations by Princeton University, as well as recent work in the cemeteries by Eustathius Raptu of the Department of Antiquities, shows that the city was not fully abandoned. The finds shown here are from one of the areas of the settlement that continued into the very early Hellenistic period. Transition to the new Ptolemaic city of Arsinoe was gradual. With the official establishment of the new city by the mid-3rd century BC, it was established by Ptolemy II Philadelphus in honor of his sister and wife, Queen Arsinoe II. As in the 4th century BC, there is a continued lack of seals and seal rings in tombs in the Hellenistic period. There are also fewer known tombs of this period at Polis. Both seal finds by the Princeton team appear to connect with Ptolemaic imagery. From this period in the settlement, there is a marked jar handle from the Hellenistic workshop in the western part of the settlement. It shows Heracles with his club and compares with rings of the 3rd to 2nd century BC, such as that shown here at the upper right. Both Alexander the Great and Ptolemy I traced their lineages to Heracles. Possibly this jar has an official stamp rather than the more personal stamps represented by the loom weights in the 4th century. Another possible Ptolemaic official seal comes from the area of a large administrative building in the northern part of the new city. Its precise find spot was a mixed deposit. The object is made of pickerlite, the light blue to gray-green Cypriot stone I described earlier. It was a finely carved pendant, possibly of Bronze Age date or even earlier. It broke at the top and was reworked for suspension. The lower surface was gouged out more roughly, and a new design was added. It shows a bird of prey, an eagle, in profile with drill marks around it. It compares with the design of Ptolemaic coinage, but the best parallel is a stamp found in a late Ptolemaic context at the sanctuary of Eurynosus on Cyprus, the object shown here at the top center. Arsinoe shifted from the Ptolemaic to the Roman Empire with little disruption. It is during this period that people began again to take their gems with them to the grave. For example, notes taken during excavations in 1886 show that at least one glass gem from a finger ring was uncovered, as you see at the upper right, and at the left, that this pendant with the goddess Nike was also found in a tomb. More recently, the Department of Antiquities uncovered this gold ring at the lower right that is inset with a bust of a woman carved in carnelian. A remarkable find from the Princeton team's excavations concludes my presentation in this overview of seals and seal rings at Marion and Arsinoe. Its find context is mixed. It is a pendant shown here at the lower right of black soft stone, likely chloratite, that may be an older pendant recut with a new design. It bears a grillos, a composite creature here with the feet of a rooster, the head of an animal, possibly a horse, and a body with the face of or mask of a man. This looks like a local version of a Roman Gnostic magical gem. A similar creature, more clearly with the head of a horse, feet of a rooster, and head or mask of a bearded man, was found set into a ring at Limni, just east of Polis, shown here at the lower left, which is a carnelian gem. I also show another similar Roman gem found on Cyprus at the top left in impression. At Polis, another Gnostic magical gem was found inset into a gold pendant of the 2nd or 3rd century BC. It shows the god Abraxas with serpent legs and the head of a rooster in armor with a whip and shield. At Polis, seals, gems, seal rings, and seal pendants were placed in tombs with their owners starting in the 8th century BC. This practice continued into the early 4th century BC at Marion and seems to have ended until the early Roman period at Arsinoe. Seals such as the 3 at the upper left were placed in sanctuaries in the Archaic period at Marion, but so far there is no evidence for seals as votives in cult space at Polis after that date. Instead, in the settlement, just as votive use came to an end, the use of seals for making impressions, especially in connection with textile production, began in the 5th and continued throughout the 4th century BC at Marion. Elsewhere, I have argued that seals at the tops of weights were markers that were meaningful during weaving, whereas marks on the sides were personal marks used during the making of weights. Official seals may best describe the impression and seal from the Ptolemaic Hellenistic period at Arsinoe. Just as seals again accompanied their owners in death in the Roman period, possibly the Roman Gnostic gem on a pendant once again suggests votive use. It is striking that as many as 4 of the seals from settlement contexts were redesigned at some point in their use lives, some starting as Bronze Age objects. This review of gemological finds at Polis perhaps raises more questions than it answers, but it provides a rich body of contextualized information about people and their gems over the course of a millennium. Thank you very much.
Joanna, thank you. That was superb. Let's call our next speaker. Meredith Wilson from Excel, Belgium will be speaking on 3 Roman finger rings with intaglios from Kourion, Cyprus. And Meredith, if you can begin and show your screen, that would be terrific.
I would first like to thank the organizers of this conference, including Dokuz Eylül University and Dr. Ergun Lafla, for offering the exciting opportunity to commune virtually with like-minded scholars in this important field. The intaglios I am presenting today are part of a larger project to assess the artifactual materials recovered through excavations of the Amethyst Gate Cemetery at Kourion in Cyprus. These were led by the late Dr. Daniel Parks of Brock University, Ontario, from 1995 to 2000. A synthesis of her fieldwork and the material finds from the site will be published in a forthcoming monograph, City and Cemetery, Excavations at Kourion's Amethyst Gate Cemetery, The Excavations of Daniel A. Parks, under the direction of her close colleague on the project, Dr. Michael Given from the University of Glasgow. My contribution to this initiative is a close study of the site's fine jewelry and metal dress accessories. As such, I would like to express my deep gratitude to Dr. Given for his ongoing support of my research on the jewelry, in addition to the Cyprus Department of Antiquities, the Cyprus Museum, and the local archaeological Kourion Museum in Episcopi for granting me access to study the jewelry, including the intaglios, firsthand in 2017. Kourion lies on the southern coast of Cyprus, immediately southwest of the modern town of Episcopi and in between the ancient cities of Paphos to the west and Amethyst to the east. The site is defined by its location on and immediately surrounding a limestone promontory rising almost 100 kilometers above sea level with sweeping views of Episcopi Bay and the coastal plains. During the Hellenistic and Roman periods, this acropolis was home to an extensive walled city. The picture obtained from almost 100 years of systematic excavations at Kourion support its characterization as a prominent provincial urban center, with residents enjoying the trappings of Greco-Roman city living. A major earthquake sometime around AD 370 and the eventual conversion of the inhabitants to Christianity, however, fostered significant changes to the spatial organization and public amenities of the city. Just outside the city walls, these changes can likewise be traced in the funerary landscape of Kourion. Following the 2nd century BC, a burial ground was developed around the base of the promontory cliff. This cemetery was accessible from a main road that led from the so-called Amethyst Gate at the southern end of the Acropolis down to the low-lying coastal fields, hence the modern name of the site. Early graves here took the form of family chamber tombs, which were subsequently cleared away at the end of the 4th century AD. In this same period, this demolition activity, in addition to quarrying at the site, produced a level platform that facilitated a shift in burial monuments from standing chamber tombs to in-ground cist graves. These cist graves remained in use until the end of the 6th century. Over the course of the excavations, 24 cist graves were recovered in regions A, B, and E of the site. All of these tombs had been reused over successive generations in antiquity, hosting multiple asynchronous burials. And with the exception of a single grave in Area A, Tomb A1, which I'll discuss shortly, all of the graves had been disturbed through human intervention, including looting. Remarkably, despite these disturbances, an assemblage of jewelry, beads, and dress accessories was uncovered among the extant funerary equipment, personal items, and faunal and skeletal remains deposited in the graves. This small collection of artifacts consists of several gold earrings and a quantity of loose beads made from gold, stone, and glass, likely strung as necklaces or bracelets. More humble articles such as rings, bracelets, hair rings, and hairpins made of bronze, iron, bone, and rarely ivory were also recovered. And most importantly for our purposes, 3 finger rings, 2 gold and 1 silver, set with intaglios were also present among the finds. The 2 gold bezel rings were recovered from the sole intact grave in Area A, Tomb A1. One of the rings from the tomb is set with a reddish-purple garnet that is small and round with a strongly convex surface. The back of the gem remains hidden from view, secured in the bezel. The surface of the stone features an intaglio of a theater mask or the head of a youth. The overall composition is tightly rendered with fairly abstract economical cutting. A series of haphazard cuts indicate tight-fitting hair with a fillet wrapped around the head, and 2 vertical lines at the base of the head could represent the ties of a fillet or of the theater mask itself. This motif and its variants were common in Roman glyptic art. Similar compositions are widely encountered in collection catalogs of engraved gems, where they are often identified as theater masks or the heads of satyrs or youths. A summary review of these catalogs would also seem to suggest a preference for convex garnets or carnelians for these motifs, as demonstrated by the handful of examples I have listed here. The possible interpretation of the Amethyst Gate Cemetery intaglio as representing a theater mask is especially intriguing given the presence of a large and important theater at Kourion, a notable feature of the city that may have made the intaglio relevant to its owner. This is purely hypothetical, however, and I should note that the theater seems to have been abandoned around the same time that the ring was buried in the ground. The second intaglio from Tomb A1 is an imitation gem made of opaque white glass set into a gold bezel ring. The glass stone is formed into an oval with a flat back and a subtly rounded surface. It features a now somewhat obscured impression of Jupiter Tonans, or thundering Jupiter, a portrayal of the god in the nude, standing in contrapposto, holding a long staff and a group of thunderbolts. The image derives from a well-known Hellenistic sculpture by Leochares, which was installed by Augustus in 22 BC in a new temple dedicated to Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. This aspect of the deity subsequently became popular in Roman visual arts and was reproduced in a range of media. One important new vehicle for these images was coinage. Augustus was the first to depict the cult statue housed in its temple on his coins, although the figure without the temple consistently featured on coins produced at imperial mints around the Mediterranean into the 4th century AD. The iconographic parallel here is of note. Liviero has recognized the correspondence between imagery on coins and glass gems from the Republican period, suggesting that the faux stones were used as signets by lower status individuals wishing to advertise allegiance to a particular ruler or military commander, an interesting theory given the provincial context of hourglass gem. However, it is also worth considering the prominence of imperial coins as decorative elements in women's jewelry from the 2nd century onwards, which may have made a motif associated with coinage especially fitting for carved or cast gems set into jewelry items. A number of extant heartstone intaglios of Jupiter Tonans testified to the motif's reproduction in more elite materials, but it is noteworthy that glass iterations are quite prevalent and perhaps more prevalent in museum collections. The process used to create these signets could have, and certainly did, result in a significant quantity of imitation gems bearing this image, ensuring that this composition was both highly accessible and very widespread. Finally, a 3rd finger ring, this one made of silver, was recovered from a separate context, Tomb 18 in Area B of the site. This intaglio is carved in nicolo, an attractive type of onyx with milky blue layers receding into dark jasper or sard. The gem is cut into an oval with beveled edges. Damage to the ring's bezel reveals that the gem has a flat back. The central scene consists of a hunter or satyr, presumably nude, wearing a tight cap. He is shown with one leg crossed over the other, standing on a short ground line. In one hand, the figure has a pedum, a curved stick used for hunting rabbits or as a shepherd's crook. In the other, he holds an unrecognizable object. The cuts are linear and somewhat schematic, making some of the compositional details, for example, the object that he's holding in his hand, difficult to make out. However, the scene still retains an expressive quality appropriate to the theme. As with the previous gems, this composition was a broadly popular one in glyptic art. Excavated examples confirm the wide geographic range of the motif, shown neatly here by 3 intaglios excavated at Caerleon in Wales. Comparable scenes often include different objects held in the figure's outstretched hand. A bunch of grapes is one of the more common features, which would clearly have marked the subject as a satyr. Other examples depict roosters or rabbits, suggesting a hunter. In either interpretation, the image holds strong pastoral associations, a theme that likely found special relevance in more remote provincial contexts. From this brief analysis, it is clear that the motifs on the Amethyst Gate Cemetery intaglios represent standard and widespread images among Roman engraved gems. As such, the use of these motifs cannot be narrowed down to a specific time frame. However, their carving styles help to provide a date range for their production. In reference to M. Maskant-Kleibrink's typology, the hardstone gems were evidently carved several centuries prior to their burial, sometime during the 2nd or 3rd century AD. Because the glass gem is cast rather than carved, a precise date cannot be easily proposed, but the presence of a hymation in the scene at least suggests a date after the 1st century. However, it seems likely the gem was produced closer to the date of deposition, probably in the 4th century, if not later. What is of particular importance with regards to these intaglios is not only their date, but the date of their ring settings. All 3 finger rings share the same general design, comprising a separately formed bezel and decorative granules on the shoulders. This style corresponds to finger ring types attributed later than the intaglios to the 4th century AD. This clear dating discrepancy between the gems and their settings has wider implications for our understanding of the trade and use of intaglios in the late Empire. The decline in glyptic art over the course of the imperial period has already been well charted in scholarship. The reuse of older engraved stones in new jewelry fashions, rather than the production of new intaglios, further contributes to our understanding of this development and strongly suggests that there was an active trade in secondhand carved stones as ready processed materials for jewelers. Given the portability of gemstones and even finished jewelry items, this likely meant the circulation of intaglios around the Mediterranean, far from their original place of production or previous ownership. Importantly, this phenomenon of recycling older intaglios is seen in contemporary excavated Roman jewelry from as far away as Britain. This testifies to the remarkable consistency in jewelry production across the Roman Empire and marks the Amethyst Gate Cemetery rings as Roman jewelry, not just stylistically and iconographically, but also through manufacturing practices. Indeed, the Romanness of the intaglios proves to be one of their most salient characteristics. Considering the other items of adornment from the site, it is evident that jewelry and dress accessories served as a key means of advertising cultural membership within this provincial community. Many of the other items recovered from the cemetery align with broadly popular Roman fashions. A pendant earring from Tomb A1, for example, the same context as 2 of the intaglios, is a typical late Roman earring type and finds easy comparison with any number of similar pieces recovered from other regions around the empire, visible here on the left. There are likewise, however, a small number of items in the assemblage that in contrast possess a distinctly local heritage. This is most clearly seen in a crescent earring recovered from Area B, an Eastern earring type with an impressive history in Cyprus and Western Asia, reaching back to the early Bronze Age, reproduced here on the right. The varying imperial and regional styles present in the jewelry from the cemetery allude to the process of negotiating civic identity in a Far Eastern provincial environment. Viewed in light of this process, the intaglios are certainly the most emphatically Roman articles in the jewelry collection, as they are quite literally engraved with symbols drawn from the Roman cultural sphere, including theater, mythology, cult ritual, and imperial power. The communication of Roman identity through the use and display of the intaglios evidently found relevance for both men and women at Caerleon, as indicated by the ring settings. The Niccolò intaglio with its very large band likely belonged to an adult male, while the glass gem's small band suggests a female owner. The small-sized band and small garnet in the 3rd ring could indicate either a female owner or a male owner who wore the piece on his little finger, a practice attested to in ancient visual and textual sources. The signs of wear and tear on the rings, most especially those with the glass and nickel gems, signal that these items were well used before burial and suggest that they played a routine material role in what was likely a daily expression of Roman identity. But while these articles were most active in the social world of the living, they likewise functioned in the commemoration of the dead. Although ultimately removed from view through burial, the inclusion of personal intaglios and jewelry with the departed reinforced his or her social and cultural identity in life and impressed this status on the memory of the community through funeral performance, especially in the final act of dressing the deceased. Although these three examples surely represent a fraction of the carved gems owned by the inhabitants of Kourion, they contribute to our understanding of the manufacture of intaglio-bearing jewelry and its use and significance among a provincial late Roman population. One thing I hope I have made clear in this presentation is the value of these objects as scientifically excavated artifacts. The preserved contexts and conditions of the rings and gems help to reconstruct nuances of intaglio use not readily accessed in the study of unprovenienced objects. And while gem collections and catalogs can be useful for typological and iconographical analyses, unexcavated items resist easy integration into discussions of carved gems as mobile social artifacts. This is something that requires more excavated comparanda to fully explicate. For this reason, it is difficult to know how the practices evidenced at Kourion may relate to intaglio use in other geographic regions of the empire and during different time periods. It is my hope that as more excavation and publication takes place, encouraged in part by important opportunities such as that presented by this conference, that the picture of intaglio use in the Roman world will be brought more fully into view. Thank you.
Meredith, thank you so much. That was a lovely, lovely presentation. I'm sure this will generate questions. We're going to move on very speedily because there's been a chat going on, Meredith, while you were speaking. We're going to slot in another paper after our next group of speakers. Our next paper is a joint paper presented by Giovanni Di Stefano and Savo Michiche, a ring with the harbor of Carthage in the Bardo, a ring with the harbor of Carthage in the Bardo Museum.
Okay, welcome. The topic of this conference is a ring of the Bardo Museum, Tunis, with the port of Carthage, from Professor Giovanni Di Stefano and Professor Salvo Michiche. In a recent publication about Carthage, on page 143, a color photograph of a famous figurative bronze bezel of a ring preserved in the Bardo Museum in Tunis was reproposed. The publisher, Samir Anullah, wrote in the own captions, "Figure carving of a port." This bezel has had in the history of studies a long treatment for the topographic importance attributed to the representation of carving since 1922, with Robert Lantier, en tel représentant en porte, in Bulletin de la Société nationale des antiquités de France, 1922, Pierre Cinta, Les Portes de Carthage, Paris, 1973, who identified the depiction of the justice melt with the image of the Punic port of Carthage. Serge Lanceul, Manuel d'archéologie punique, Les réalisations matérielles, Paris, 1976. There are connections to the first draft of Cinta. To finish with the two articles of Jacques Debert, Les portes puniques de Carthage sur une intel du musée de Bardo, Junior 1975, which adeptly welcomes the identification of Cinta, and that 2 years later, the cast is re-edited. Jacques Deberg, in Tel de Carthage figurant en porte, In 1977, thanks to the director of the Bardo Museum, Ms. Dr. Fatima Nightingale, for authorizing the publication, but unfortunately, a direct autopsy view was not possible. The bezel was discovered in Carthage by Sacha Chavan, who donated to the Bardo Museum. The bezel is oval in shape and measures 1.5 centimeter in length by 1.1 in width. 3 restrained little staffs appear on the edge of the same. A trimming of the edge along the perimeter of the carving surface led Sintas to think about the insertion of a beetle, but this is not very likely. The carving depicts a port basin in the form of a semicircle with the arcaded edge. At the top of the carving, just above the porch, there is a building with a 6-column front surmounted by a triangular pediment. Next of this building, further to the foreground, there is a circular building, a tholos, with columns. 4 are evident, which are surmounted by a strange domed roof, a lantern, maybe. On the right half of the bezel is a square divided into 4 compartments. This is surmounted by a building with 9 columns on the face and a double sloping roof. Below still appears another circular building, of which 10 columns are visible. In the port basin are depicted 2 ships, maybe 2 corbettes, in profile opposite, one stern and the other bow, one in front. The 3rd vessel is depicted near the end of the colonnade, on the edge of semicircle, probably at the entrance of the port in the starting position. The ships in the center of the port basin have only one central 3-with square sail, of which the roped sculls which with the soparum are evident. A small triangular sail, a matigli, about the flagpole. In the 2 boats depicted in profile in the center of the basin, the stern and bow are at the same level. However, maybe it's possible to distinguish in both a significant enlargement of the stern wheel with the probable indication of a bronze ornament, as one head might be, obviously not distinguishable. The wool also appeared to be made evident by boundaries. Finally, it's likely that the 2 appendices that seem to leak out of the 2 sterns are to be attributed to rudder oars. On the other hand, the identification of the building depicted in somewhat more problematic. Apart from the semicircular porch and the building with columns about the porch and therefore beyond the port, for the other buildings depicted in the bezel, perhaps some functions can be hypothesized. However, before making any hypothesis, it's appropriate to repeat the comparison already presented by Lantier and Deberg in 1975 between the figuration of the Carthage bezel and the 4 specimens of gems. The first specimen on the left, known by Furtwängler, and the second on the right, documented by Alessandro Cades, are similar to that of Carthage, but with only 1 ship in the basin. The other 2 bezels are also documented by Cades, are the same of those of Carthage. It's therefore likely that their works belonged to a single matrix that depicted a landscape, an important and well-known monument in antiquity. In the gems compared to the Carthage bezel, images are mirrored and with small differentiation. One can attempt to identify these buildings by thinking of the port of Carthage of imperial age, thinking to a very recent study of the port of Carthage of Lavinia del Basso in Cartagine Studi e Ricerche 2017. The islet so-called of the Admiral, according to our idea, is the landscape theater referred in the engraving of the bezel. As it well known in the island and the center of the column were built in the age of Commodus, a quay and an iconic colonnade, and arches with about 50 columns with an intercolumn of 4 meters. Another colonnaded gallery was added to the interior. This gallery would, in our opinion, be shown on the left side of the bezel. Not wanting to detail here the building interventions on the island in the second phase, that's between the middle of the 2nd century and the end of the 3rd century AD, some constructions should be recommended. The so-called Temple 2 rectangular plane of 7.25 m for 13.2 with 3 cells, a 4-faced arc with 3 barrel vaults and an arc to a back to a barrel vault. A 4 count in the west of the island, added in the 4th century AD, paved with large scales of limestone, with a porch of the cast and warehouse to the west. This circular monument, called a Tower of Attolos, also octagonal building, was in operation until the 5th century AD. The circular monument was initially identified by English excavator as a pseudo-tholos lighthouse with a 8 free column inside, leaning against a back wall covered with bricks and surmounted by a lantern with a maximum height of 16 meters. But this function has been abandoned by English diggers Hunt, Horst, in favor of other destinations. A monopteral temple of the Conditorium Zeugitanorum, the warehouse for the registration and storage of notary foodstuffs. The octagonal building, on the other hand, has been correctly identified by Lavinia del Basso, not as a lighthouse, but as a signal tower, as it was already perhaps in the Punic age, conquer Appian, and how well, for example, buildings similar to the Portis at Leptis Magna. On a coin of the mint of Laodicea ad Mare of Severian age is depicted a tower with a male figure that indicated the direction to the pilot of the boat. We think to identify the tower building in the bezel with the signaling tower existing in the port of Carthage. The depiction of Carthage's bezel is made with a bird's eye view and according to the synthetic principle as of the late antiquity, typical of Constantine onwards. Our conviction is that in the bezel is represented precisely the interior of the small port of Carthage, with a colonnade and with the monument on the island, the beacon and the other buildings evident even in Berlin gems. The square evident in the bezel of Carthage and in the gems, in our opinion, is the perspective representation of the large square paved, whose representation in gems is expressed even with more details. The building represented below and above the respectively the portico that skirted the east side of the square and temple too. Representation of port architectures are not unusual on the coinacious example, one of Nero, Sestertius with the port of Ostia, or Traian, a Sestertian still with the port of Ostia. Port landscapes are also sometimes on the sarcophagi. Some examples of this by way of example, the sarcophagus of Copenhagen 1299, perhaps with the port of Ostia also, the sarcophagus of Julius Philosirius with the port of Alexandria. Port scenes appear on some oil lamps, and 3 have been proposed a generic identification with the port of Carthage, but the details are generic, too generic, and of course don't take us back to the precise iconography of our bezel. Some examples. An oil lamp from Carthage, today at the Museum of Carthage, of Deneuve XA shape of the 3rd century AD, which was in the disc of the depiction of a horse show porch with columns supporting a double sloping cover. An oil lamp from the Museum of Besançon, type Lerche VI from the end of the 3rd century AD, similar to the previous one. An oil lamp from Leptis Magna, Deneuve XA type from the 3rd century AD, also similar to the previous ones. On the dating of the bezel, we don't believe there is any doubt. Already Jacques de Berg, in the 2nd article dedicated to the bezel, and Latomus specified the chronological assignment to the Lower Empire. We can certainly agree, indeed. We think we specify that the bezel can date back to the end of the 4th century AD. And we believe that the iconography reproduced is that of a port architecture, and in particular of the Roman imperial port of Carthage. The depiction of a landscape representing the port of Carthage on gems and a ring bezel can, in our opinion, perhaps be related to a historical event that had as its protagonist the port of the African city. We think it's not unlikely the casting to celebrate the importance of the city, seat of the provincial governor, with great relevance of the cursus publicus and home to the food rationing fleet, and anchored in the port of the city of Carthage, just that port carved in the bezel preserved in the Bardo Museum. Thanks for listening.
Salvo, thank you so much. That is an incredibly beautiful ring, and I'm sure there'll be questions. If you've been following the chat, Ergun had indicated that we would have another speaker. Unfortunately, Natalia Novochenkova is still having problems, so that will be tabled. So we now have time for questions for the four presenters from this particular session. It's hard to see everybody's, if a hand is raised, so perhaps you could just unmute yourself and ask a question directly to one of our four speakers. So please proceed. Actually, I'll begin then. Meredith, I was very interested in that gold ring. What struck me is let's say the quality of the carving, or I mean the style, notwithstanding whether it's a theater mask or whatever, the quality of carving is certainly not what I would have expected in a gold ring, given the fact that the mounting is very precious. Can you talk about the style and actually the quality?
Sure. Are you referring to the garnet ring or the cast?
Yes. Oh, the one with the possible theater image.
That was it's an exceptionally beautiful piece, and it's in really excellent condition considering there's a little bit of minimal damage to the outside of the bezel, showing that it was worn a small bit, but really there's no wear and tear on the granules, which is something that you typically see in finger rings with granulation. You know, as they rub against the finger through wear, they sort of flatten down. So it seems like it was a pretty expensive piece, and it was relatively new at the time it was deposited, and sort of seen in concert with that that pendant earring that I showed as well. That's a very typical Roman style pendant earring. It seemed like, I mean, if we can imagine that they came from the same individual, which possibly they did, it must have been a very impressive display. It would have been, it seems like all of those pieces went into the ground relatively shortly after they were made, and they were really finely made pieces, and probably relatively expensive. So yeah, just really that's one of my favorite articles from the collection, and something I unfortunately didn't have time to include. The interesting thing about that ring is that the band of the ring is formed from a short length of loop-and-loop chain, which is something you typically see in flexible necklace designs rather than in rings. And I was sort of pulling my hair out trying to figure out what was comparative to that. And there's actually a small ring in the Thetford treasure that was excavated. It's a late 4th century hoard from Britain that has a piece that looks pretty similar. It's got a loop and loop chain band, it's got granulation, and it uses garnets, inset garnets, as a decoration. So it really is sort of remarkable to find this level of consistency and high quality, even across the breadth of the empire in these sort of faraway provinces.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, Joanna, please.
Well, to continue, since we were talking about Meredith's paper, I had a couple of questions. And one, I know that the cemetery area was extensively looted, but there are some human remains, and I was impressed that you had thought about the size of the ring in relationship to people's fingers. And I was wondering whether there's any overlap at all between what you said about, male fingers versus female fingers and human remains in the tombs and all of that.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, because unfortunately that was something that I had to remove as well for time constraints. Unfortunately, the stratigraphy of the site is pretty complex, and it was pretty heavily disturbed. The tombs were reused over successive generations, so each time it was reopened, they kind of shoved everything that was already in there out of the way and laid a new deposit down. And then you have looting and commemorative activities, and there was also a fair amount of industrial activity that took place at the site, including quarrying, and there was a lime kiln. So Chris Mavromatis, who has been working on the project, I guess since its conception, has done this really masterful reconstruction of the stratigraphy of the site. Unfortunately, it sort of precludes this easy association of objects with specific individuals. when I was there in a study session, the osteological expert sort of cheekily at one point handed me a finger ring or a finger bone with some staining on it that had indicated that it initially had bore a ring, and as decomposition set in, it had stained the bone. So it's clear that these people were buried physically wearing the jewelry, but unfortunately through the disturbances, we can't link specifically to individuals. Tomb A1 did have the remains of 2 adult females and an adult male. So the jewelry that was from that site, from that particular context, could have belonged to a single individual, could have belonged to sort of been spread out among the group. Tomb B18, I believe, had an adult female and several unidentified individuals. So unfortunately, not as easily connected as I would have hoped, but it's there. It bears consistency with the osteological findings, even if it can't be quite fine-tuned.
Thank you. I also had a question for Handan. I don't know if I can ask that.
Are there other questions? And then Joanna will get back to you. Anyone else want to join in? Okay, Joanna, please continue. And Handan, you're on mute.
Yeah, I was struck by, in looking at the head of Athena and looking at the comparative material, that your piece has this very strong mark at the chin that's missing from the others. And I don't know, it was just so visually interesting. And I was wondering, you know, what is that? Is that just a quirk of the carver? It almost looked beard-like. And I know that, you know, she doesn't have a beard, but it was just so interesting. I was wondering what you thought about that.
Have you found other with the same mold?
No, I think no. The Professor Di Stefano now is at university, not here. But he said to me that this bezel is only one, not other with the same depictions, apart of the other examples I mentioned in the presentation. No other.
Okay,
Thank you.
And I think we're ready for you. Thank you. Joanna, did you need to repeat the question perhaps?
Well, I was asking about the Athena and the fact that there's this very strong mark at the chin that was different from all the comparative pieces. And I just wondered if that was just a quirk of the particular carver, and whether you had any thoughts about that.
My connection is very loud at this moment. I don't hear.
Well, no, it wasn't a question for you. It was the question that I had for Handan. You're not hearing me. Is that what you're saying?
Can you please also write the question, not for me?
Okay, I'll type it out. Why don't we carry on with something else and I'll put it in the chat.
Angeliki, did you have another question or did Salvo answer?
To Professor Mitsuke, the pronunciation. I had the question about the motive, thank you. And I would like to say that this motive reminds me of the description of Vergil's Aeneid. Of course, Vergil describes that they saw theatrical buildings, but so spontaneously I remember about the description of Vergil's Aeneid. Very interesting, this motive.
Yes, sure. This was a motive very used in the century of the imperial, but perhaps also in the BC centuries. However, how I said first, we don't have any other more examples of this. Free from an oil lamps, 2 or 3 coins, but not others. It in literature is very used this motive, but in this sense, perhaps not so more.
Thank you.
Handan, did you see Joanna's question in the chat? If you might look in the
Yeah,
chat.
Professor Nancy, I think that Dr. Handan has some kind of problems with the microphone. So
Okay.
if you excuse me, I will answer the question.
Okay,
The
perfect.
question was that the Athena's chin was different. And there was any different carver about that. And as far as she told me that there is no other example except that. And since there is no other example, it might be a local craftsman who carved this particular piece. So in this case, that she also stated that she's not a expert on gem, and that's why. And also, since there is no other example, she has no knowledge about it. So yeah, that was the
Okay,
answer.
thank you very much.
I'm going to, I do have one more question I'd like to pose, but we're cutting into our break. So perhaps we can say, anybody who needs to take a break, by all means, go take the break. But those who want to continue the discussion will still be here. My question actually is for Joanna. I'm wondering if you can say a little something, Joanna, about method of production.
I'm sorry, I can't switch it.
No, we're going to wait for you, Natalia. So just hang on. Joanna, method of production. I'm intrigued by the fact that loom weights, some of them carry the impression of a finger ring. How would that work? I mean, does the loom weights, would imagine, are made in a workshop. Does a woman go in and order a set of loom weights and present her ring and say, stamp my set with this ring? How do you imagine how that?
Yeah, well, that's actually, I gave a paper, amazingly, just as we have a conference all about gems. I was recently at a conference that was all about the relationship between textiles and seals. In any case, so the earlier weights are slightly less high fired. And I made the argument that the marks are placed specifically so that they can be seen during weaving, and that they are that those are likely made more by hand by the actual weavers.
Really?
And there is actually really good evidence that people went to great lengths to make sure the mark was visible at the top. And that comes not only from Polis, but from some other sites on Cyprus. But as we get to the later part of the 4th century with these disc-shaped weights, they're much higher fired. And there's actually evidence from Nicosia that they are being made centrally in centralized kilns, that you would bring your weights or you would bring your seal to somebody who made weights, and that they were fired in a centralized kiln. And also those marks then would not be visible during weaving because they're on the sides of the weights, so they'd be hidden. And so the purpose of the marks changes, but also remarkably all across Cyprus, not just in Polis, the nature of the fabric being made on the warp weighted loom changes at the same time to a much heavier type of fabric. Earlier on, it's consistently all the way from the late Bronze Age through the early Iron Age down into the very early Classical period. The warp weighted loom is almost exclusively used to make a very lightweight gauzy fabric. So it's I don't know exactly why, but there really is a pattern there. And it's interesting to see how the seals link with that and the practice of textile production.
But if a household makes its own loom weights and then stamps them and it's household production, would the firing take place just putting the loom weights, the homemade loom weights, in the hearth?
That could be done. They're fairly low fired. They're not so low fired that they fall apart immediately, but they're not. I don't think they require a coroplast necessarily to fire them.
Are there other comments and or questions? So Natalia, please share your screen and we'll start.
One of the expressed examples of the masterpieces of the Gnostic art from the sanctuary near the pass Gurzu Saddle in the Crimean Mountains is an Cornelian inset of late Hellenistic origin of an oval form depicting a Helios head, profile left, presumably portraying Alexander the Great, the ruler of Hellenistic world, flattened in the gem in the image of solar deity. What can be seen comparing with the portrait of Alexander the Great on the stater of Lysimachus type, city of Byzantium, found in the sanctuary. The other gem carved in carnelian is depicting a standing female figure, possibly the Artemis. The object is oval in shape and underside is flat and front is convex. The female figure in a short tunic is turned to the left. The hair on the back of the head is bundled. In her left hand lowered back, she holds a one-handled vessel. The right hand is bent and raised to them in the elbow. One of the gems carved from carnelian is with the image of the head of the deity or hero. It's in the form of a round flat disc with slightly rounded edges. An image with large and sharp facial features is represented here. The head maybe is with a helmet. The image of a branch of a palm tree as a symbol of victory is shown in the front of the face. The silver pendant with banded glass engraved gem with the image of a rider. An oval-shaped silver pendant with an inset made of mosaic glass depicting a rider probably of the time of Augustus Claudius. Glass layers are painted in milky white, green, and blue. The base of the inset is assembled of two segments of green glass on the sides, a strip of blue in the center, and two strips of milk white glass separating the blue strips from the green side segments. The inset had miniature dimensions. The engraved gem with clear contours represents a perfect composition inscribed in a small oval space. The rider is depicted in a calm pose. Such small details of the image as bearded face, two spears, an oval-shaped shield, and the surface of the earth are well visible. Similar intagliate insets are known in the collection of the British Museum, the Paul Getty Museum. Mostly indifferent mythological characters are depicted, while a steady combination of colors is observed, green, white, and blue. The combination was considered as an imitation of the heliotrope mineral, as Pliny wrote about. The close to Italia from Gurzu Saddle is a copy stored in the British Museum, an image of a standing naked bearded warrior with a spear and shield on his shoulder. Perhaps this is an image of a Gallic warrior created like a glass intaglia from Gurzu Saddle by the same master. Or he is a soldier from the auxiliary troops of the Roman army. The Roman time intaglia from the sanctuary of the Gurzu Saddle Pass is a wonderful art glass product and belongs to the category of rare works of ancient applied art. There, intalia from carnelian with the image of the Swan of Abundance. The edge is broken. The entirety of the oval flattened shape is made of light orange carnelian. An image of an abundant spawn in the framing of plant shoots is engraved on the front surface. During the reign of Augustus, which marked victory and the onset of prosperity, the horn of abundance played an important role in political propaganda and affirmation of the state cult, along with other symbols such as the triumphal arch, the altar of Diana, the Capricorn, a bunch of mature heirs, and cult figures, the goddess of the peace flags. There the reverses of four Christophori Aisha Minor from the sanctuary Burguskaya Sedlo are represented. Analogies to this engraved gem are found in the Roman legionary fortress Halkern, Limes Germanicus, Lippe River Valley, which existed for a short period of time from 7 BC to the 9 AD, only 16 years. The Carnelian gem with a serial spike was made in the form of serial grain with an engraved image of a ripened bread spike. Ripe grains are clearly visible. You see them. This may be due both to the propaganda of the political cause of Augustus, the coming golden age, the century of fertility and abundance, and at the same time, the cult of fertility. The sixth stone in Talia, made from a garnet, has an image of an insect and is mounted the golden ring. A bee flying to the left with a raised wing is depicted. Beekeeping in the ancient world played a noticeable economic role. According to Greek myth, the bee is a breadwinner of Zeus. This group of engraved gems from the sanctuary belongs to the category of elite items that came to the sanctuary at the turn of our era. The symbolism of images and gems from the sanctuary near the Burguskaya Sedlo reflected the ideas of victory, peace, prosperity, and worship associated with the Hellenistic Roman aesthetics of the late Hellenism and early Principate period, a deification of power, state cult, solar cult, fertility cult. The advent of a new golden century was propagated in the art of small forms from the era of Hellenism and especially brightly in the era of the early Principate during the reign of Augustus. Thank you for attention.
Natalia, thank you so much. Those were beautiful objects and we all appreciate you showing us the material. Again, thank you to everyone. And I suspect that we're going to begin again with our next session.